Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, the last time we spoke to him was about a YA novel, the first in a series. This one is the third in a graphic novel series, definitely not for kids. Godflare is volume 3 of The Reckoner Rises. David Robertson joins us on the program. Welcome back, David.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I'm very curious, writing for a different audience, it's like a gear shift for you as an author?
In some ways it is. I mean, there is an element of, writing for children as opposed to writing for adults, where you want to make sure that you're not, talking down to a child. And, there's a lot of things that you can write in children's literature that children understand and that they can definitely get, and that they're mature enough and smart enough to absorb and internalize in a good way. So in some ways, it's not as big of a shift as you might think it is. But on the same hand, there's also like content that you can go to, places where you can go to that you can't with children's literature. So I think it's more the stuff that people might say, like the maturity level, or the things that you can show that you wouldn't like show to a child, a youth. And so I think it's more like that than it is like the concept or ideas of the book. So yeah, I think you can just like do more and go to kind of darker places. And so that's what I've seen happen in the Reckoner Rises trilogy. Well, I think what would it be, a tetralogy? I don't know.
Right, because it's not done. Series. So quadrilogy, is that the right one? If it's 4,
I think it's a tetralogy.
Okay.
I mean, I looked this. I think I googled it the other day just because I was like, what do you call a 4-book series? So I think it's a tetralogy, but I could be wrong.
Sure enough. So it's not necessarily like dumbing it down for kids when it comes to content. It's that you can maybe address some similar like macro issues, but like the micro can be more specific or a little more mature. Am I hearing that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, definitely not dumbing down to children. I mean, there's like the Misawa Saga series, which is the fantasy series I've been working on. And that's a 6-book series. I don't even know what you call that. But that has a lot of ideas in it, like a lot of really complex issues. And it's a middle grade book. So so I think it's like it's never dumbing down. It's just being able to go to places you wouldn't be able to go to. And like there's a lot of like stuff in this book that is scary. That I took a lot of inspiration from different horror sources, for example, that I just wouldn't do, even in like the first iteration of the story, which was in the YA trilogy. That was a pretty edgy series. This graphic novel series goes, even edgier, I think, because I did write it with like high school to adults in mind.
Is there like a pitch shift to things, like when you move from a high school audience to an adult audience? Like, are you thinking of those readers as older and what they're capable of?
Yeah, I think it's like what they're able to see and what they're able to hear based on their level of maturity. So there's a lot of like scenes here that are really disturbing. Really frightening. They're not gratuitous because they all serve a purpose. But yeah, there's things here that I would never put in like a YA graphic novel, or certainly not a middle grade graphic novel or middle grade novel. But that in a way that freed me up to do a lot of the things I wanted to do with this series. The whole idea with it, beyond just like following the superhero origin story into the realization of a real superhero, like a ready to go superhero, was growing with the reader, and assuming that readers of the Reckoner trilogy, which is Strangers, Monsters, and Ghosts, that they would now, read this series, and they're older. Maybe some of them are out of high school, and but they're still interested in the characters. They're still invested into their journeys, and so now here we are, and let's really get into this. Let's really go deep, and let's see what kind of like really messed up stuff that we can do that still addresses some of the societal issues that I want to address in the whole arc of the story.
How much of that arc is plotted out, like, before you even think of, the first book in a series? Like, do you think about kind of the long tail of things? Like, this is, like, when you started the first Reckoner book, did you think about like what life it had beyond those first 3 books? Or is that something you come back to and think, oh, I could go back here?
So the first trilogy, I had that trilogy planned out pretty detailed. So I kind of knew when I started writing Strangers, I knew where Ghosts would end. So I had a pretty good idea of where I was going and how I would get there. But conceptually, after book 3, I just had this conceptual idea, that this is what the graphic novel series would, because I always plan to write comics based on the Reckoner character. And so the concept of it was really just twofold. It was, I wanted to have this fully realized Kree superhero. I wanted to make the world bigger. And that was really it. And I guess like for the tetralogy, if that's what we'll call it, I'm going to be embarrassed if that's wrong. But I just had this like idea of like the momentum of this leading to like an Avengers Endgame kind of like superhero supervillain standoff, and that was the kind of the really the concept I had for this 4-book series. And so while I had ideas of like what I wanted to happen, the issues I wanted to address, some of the visuals that I wanted to incorporate, there's a lot of freedom in telling the story because I didn't have this super outlined arc. I just had like images, concepts, and this finish line that I always knew where we were going to get to. And not to give any spoilers, but like book 4 is really just this like really huge battle. So book 3 sets it up pretty much.
Right. This is Infinity War leading to Endgame.
Yeah. I get, you're right. Yes, exactly. This is like the Infinity War, and the Endgame is like book 4. Essentially, like the concept is like, let's have all these like these villains and heroes that are being manufactured. Let's have them face off into this like huge, super cool, super violent battle that wages for like 30 pages of this end book 4 graphic novel. So the book 3 is like the lead up to like what is this like huge payoff. I hope it is anyway. I think it is.
You had mentioned sources and inspiration. Like, how much reading do you do outside of creation that like isn't within the context of like thinking about your own work? Like, do you read for pleasure and then find yourself ruminating on things and thinking, oh, I'd like to absorb that or like create something like that? Or do you read purposefully with like the thought, like, what are other people doing in the superhero genre if I'm going to, do a superhero work?
Yeah, there's a lot of intentionality with my reading. And there has to be, because it has to be focused. I don't have a lot of time to do a ton of reading. I have a big stockpile of work that I have contracts for, that is, that I have to write or edit, and then there's my job at Penguin Random House where I'm running an entire imprint, a new imprint there, and that takes up a lot of time as well. So a lot of my reading now is like submissions for my imprint, or books I'm blurbing, or very few that I'm just reading for pleasure. So when I read for pleasure, I I call it pleasure because reading's awesome. But I definitely read with purpose. So that's exactly right. Like when I'm reading something, I'm reading to learn. I'm reading to like absorb. And then even when I'm watching stuff, I'm watching to try to learn storytelling techniques, learn, structuring of story, character development, like that sort of thing, because I'm always learning. A lot of this, though, in book 3, Godflare, is pulling from like things I've read when I was younger, even when I was a kid, when I was a young adult. Taking all these things that I've loved and trying to like find a way to mash them all together, and make it into something that like pays homage to all these things that I've really admired as a consumer of popular culture, and then trying to give readers something that they will also love, maybe hopefully as much, or at least they'll see like these ties and really appreciate them, because a lot of like little Easter eggs here, little nods to other things that I've really loved as like an absorber of popular culture.
Were you a Deadpool reader?
I mean, Deadpool is definitely a character that I took some inspiration from for Cole, Harper. Wolverine, Deadpool. He's kind of like this character that is a bit of a mashup of like a few different superheroes that I've really liked over the years. Cole's powers are, for me, like Cole, whose alter ego is, I guess, I'd call him the Reckoner. He's got like these powers that, first of all, the most important thing for me were that they had to be like atypically, not an indigenous superhero power thing. So, nothing like shamanistic, nothing that would be like, spiritual, or like, he can summon like, these spirit animals or something that you feel with like are very stereotypical indigenous superheroes. I wanted him to just have like very stereotypical superhero powers. So he's very strong, he can heal, stuff like that. So but yeah, so like Deadpool, Wolverine, and then just like like he's probably about as strong as Spider-Man, that sort of thing. So and those are some of my favorite superhero characters, and so I wanted Cole to be like his own thing, but to draw on different powers, but at the same time not to be boring powers, but to be powers you've seen before, because I didn't want him to fall into the paradigm of like the indigenous superhero. I wanted him to be like outside of that, because it's something that you don't expect, but that you realize that an indigenous person could have any power if they're a superhero. They don't have to have like, I summon the great spirit of the eagle, like they can just be like, they can shoot laser beams out of their eyes. So that's kind of like the thing I was going for in developing Cole and his powers.
His indigeneity is not linked to his superheroism. Like he's a superhero who happens to be indigenous.
Exactly. And I think there's like a lot of things about him that, that honor his heritage as a Cree person. But he just, you're right. He's like this Cree person who happens to have powers, and these powers aren't tied to his culture. Even though he does have strong ties to his community and culture, his powers aren't one of them. His powers are just his powers.
The reason I was asking about the Deadpool was because of the fourth wall breaking.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's so yeah, that the fourth wall breaking definitely is a bit of Deadpool. It's a bit of Coyote too. So like the whole idea, when I was writing the trilogy, the first trilogy, I started doing it without even noticing. And I was talking with Harold Johnson, who's like, he's deceased now. He was one of our best Indigenous writers. If you haven't read a book like called The Power of Story, he was a great guy, great writer. And he emailed me once because I wrote this story about Coyote, the trickster character, and he was like, I want to talk to you about tricksters because I had the same experience. And what we talked about was how these trickster characters in our stories, and Chach is this recurring character in the Reckoner story, who talks to the reader. He kind of exists outside of the story itself. And so when I was writing, Chach, he was able to talk to the reader. He was able to like, look outside the page and talk to whoever was out on the other side. And when I was doing that, the first few times it happened, I actually remembered calling my editor, and I was like, Desiree, is her name. I was like, can I do that? And she's like, I mean, yeah, that's kind of fun. And so I kind of like I lost control of the character, and which was really cool. And so he just continued to do it for the entire story, and he still does it. And so a lot of the times when he talks to the reader, talks outside of the story, he is doing it without my permission, and that's kind of fun, where I can just let him do whatever he wants. And so when you see him in this this 4-book series, including Godflare, he just is doing his own thing, and when I'm writing him, I just let him go. And so yeah, but the fourth wall breaking, I think there's a precedent there in Deadpool. There's a precedent there in, like, some of our storytelling and indigenous storytelling, and what the trickster is able to do. But so that's, yeah, it comes from a lot of different places.
Yeah, Harold is a past guest on this show, and definitely encourage people to go back and listen to our conversations about his books. You let him take some shots at you too.
Yeah,
it's not just like fourth wall
well,
breaking to the audience.
Fair game.
Yeah, so like, is that like kind of the voice on your shoulder in some sense when you're writing, like that he's able to do that to you?
Absolutely. I think, like, he's almost like he's like a part of me, this, like, the part of me that's self-critical, and he's able to tell me things that I'm doing that suck, or that, like, I'm not doing well, and he kind of like is ribbing me. And I do that to myself consistently, and so yeah, I think it's fair to say that he at times is going to come after me as the writer and tell me, like, things that I'm not doing well, or that things that, like, I'm, maybe doing something that is completely stereotypical, or, like, whatever it might be. He's like calling me out. And it's interesting because the one of the things I haven't talked about with this series is the mental health aspect. And Cole it's very thick in this series. And Cole is someone who deals with mental health struggles. I deal with it in my own life, and I have a book coming out in January called All the Little Monsters. It's a memoir about mental health, and the concept of that is, like, there's always this monster on your shoulder whispering into your ear about all the things that you can't do, all the things that you can't be, all the bad things that are going to happen in your life. And that's that you have to, the goal of it is to learn how to live with that voice and learn how to quiet it or ignore it. And so I think there's a bit of that as a metaphor in Chach, the trickster, in this series, how he's able to also address me. He's also that little thing on my shoulder whispering to me. And so he's a bit of a manifestation of that as well.
He also serves a function where he stops the audience from going into the sweat lodge. And I was curious about kind of the honoring what happens in sweat lodge being, like, kept in ceremony, and like forcing the audience to realize that, and, like, kind of essentially, like, not letting the camera go there. How important is building that scene?
Very important. I remember when I was starting to write 7 Generations, which is my first published work. I had an elder who told me, you can't write about our ceremonies, like these specific ceremonies. You can't write about those. That's not for other people to be shared in that way. And so I was very mindful of not showing certain things, because it was like, not proprietary, but it was definitely, like, protective cultural knowledge, and the things that happen within these ceremonies. And so I wanted to be mindful of that I'm always mindful of it whatever book I write. But yeah, like when we're going to go into the sweat lodge in this book, Chach is like, nope, this is not for you to see. This is not the way to see it. And so we're going to just pause here. I'm going to chat with you for a little bit while this is happening. And then when it's done, we can go back to the story, or we're going to switch over here. So yeah, I think it's like, there's this thing where, there's you have to be protective of our ceremonies, of our practices. And there's a time and a place to learn about them. And it's not a horror story. It's not a horror graphic novel. And I think this story, more than any story in the 4-book series, is a horror story. So I just think that was a way for me to use Chach as a defense mechanism to make sure that I'm protecting cultural practices.
If this one's the horror one, do you consider like tropes and what you're doing within those tropes, like in terms of like are you giving Scott, leeway to kind of come up with imagery, or are you telling him these are the images I want to kind of build on based on tropes in horror?
Yeah, absolutely. Scott and I have a very like symbiotic relationship. We've been working together now for like 15 years. He's a very good friend of mine. And we know how we tell stories. He knows how I tell stories. I know how he tells stories. There's a lot of trust in our relationship. And that's why I think we do things so well together, is because, there are things now that I can let him do that I never would have let him do 14 years ago or 15 years ago, because I know that he'll do it well. I know that he'll do it the right way. I know that he knows how I tell stories and what I want to see, and I have a lot of trust for him to realize things in the way that I imagine them in my weird little brain. And so there's definitely times when I tell him, Scott, like I call him Scotty. He doesn't like it, but his mom doesn't like it. But that's what I call him. So, but I'll call him Scott in respect to his mom. And so I'll be like, Scott, like, watch this scene for this image, like, and then that's kind of like your inspiration. There's a graphic novel series I did for the Maritimes, like Newfoundland, Labrador. There's a scene in that one of those comics where I just said, watch Bon Iver's video for Holocene, and then let's do the 10 pages of the scene in this comic. And so sometimes I'll do that. So there's definitely parts of this graphic novel Godflare where I told him, Scott, like, check out A Clockwork Orange, or Scott, like, watch this scene in whatever it might be. And so that'd be cool. And other times I'll just be like, Scott, like, in the script, I'll be like, Scott, just do your thing, man. Here's what I want to see, but like, you just take it and go, man. And so he'll just do it. So, yeah, so there's a lot of times where if I'm really, really, specific in what I want to see, I'll tell him, this is what I want you to draw. But other times I'll just be like, you do it, and there's a big fight scene in the fourth book that he hasn't done yet, where I just told him, here's 10 pages. Here's I almost wrote like as a prose narrative. And I just said, you take this, you break it up, you make it into panels, and you do this fight scene. And so that's that. So we go both ways, and I think it really works for us. So, but I think the heart of it all is the trust that we have in each other, and I think it really helps the story.
That leads me to a question about pacing and how you build in kind of like the splash page type aspect of like where there's like a story beat and like a pause. How much direction are you giving Scott, or how much is on the page from you to him as to like when those like full panel or like large page kind of moments happen?
Yeah, that's where I probably am still a little anal. Like Scott always calls me anal. So I do have pretty detailed scripts I write still for all my books, for graphic novels. So I think a lot about pacing. I think a lot about, even like panel to panel transitions, how they affect pacing, and what you're showing in them, how that affects pacing, like whether they're like, whether you're transitioning from one moment to the next, or whether you're transitioning from one action to the next, and how that affects, the quickness or the slowness of the pacing. And when you just need to take a beat and just like show this something really spectacular in a splash page, maybe it's on a page turn where there's a big reveal or something like that. So, I mean, yeah, I definitely think a lot about pacing. I think a lot about page turns. I think a lot about like, what's the reveal? I think a lot about, almost like sectioning off moments in the graphic novel into like chapters or, things like that. So I do have definitely very specific and detailed scripts in that way. And sometimes it changes where, like just because of, I might have written too much. And so Scott needs to, scale back the amount of panels per page. Or we know that we need to stretch it out a page. So we make something into a splash, and so there's a discussion there on like, okay, what's the best panel here to expand into a splash. But typically it's, it's me choosing the moment that we really want to have a huge impact, making that into the splash. And then we kind of like move back into the regular, 4 to 6 panel per page structure. But yeah, it's very thought out. It's very meticulously planned, I think. And there's in that way, there's very little deviation, although there is a little bit as we go through it together.
Obviously, there's a limit on how wordy you can be in a graphic novel, right? Like it's just not all text. What kind of impact does that have on you as a writer in other formats? Like, do you find that you're honed down, or like or do you get to kind of like stretch your legs when you do something else because you've had to kind of curtail maybe some of the wordiness in a graphic novel?
Absolutely. I think that, when you write a graphic novel, you learn as you do more of them that less is more, and so you learn the power of images, and you learn that, words need to be supportive or additive to the image. And the words are never really front and center. A great graphic novel, you take out all the words and you can follow the story without having any words in it. And so you have to, when I write a script, I think most about images, and then I add words that help the story without putting anything in there that doesn't need to be in there. And I think like with as a writer, as a graphic novels, of comic books, we often, well, what I would call it is like giving up our egos, and just realizing that, we're serving the story, and oftentimes, almost all the time, I would say less is more. And so when I'm going through like a rough of a graphic novel, I'll ask myself, does this need to be here? Does this need to be here? Does this need to be here? And if it doesn't, I cut it out. And there's some pages, some panels where there's no words at all, no caption boxes, no speech bubbles, because I know that they just don't need to be there. The images say everything that it needs to say. And there's some comics where I've challenged myself to write, there's a 10-page stretch in the comic book I was talking about earlier, where there's no words at all. Like there's no onomatopoeia, there's no captions, there's no speech bubbles, there's no thought bubbles. It's all images. And like I wrote, 20 pages of script for that, but no words of mine appear on the page. And so I have to be okay with the fact that the reader might not see what I did there. And I have to be okay with that because it helps the story, and that's what you have to do as a writer. You need to serve the story. And so, I think that like when I write a novel, it's all words, I'm all there. But I don't feel like it's like, okay, now I can have all my words back when I write a novel. I just know the different forms of literature and what they require, and how to best serve the form and genre of literature I'm writing in my experience as a writer.
Well, Godflare is the third volume in the Reckoner Rises, and I looked it up. It's both a tetralogy and a quadrilogy. Tetralogy.
Oh, we're both right. There you go.
Tetralogy is the Greek, and Latin is the quadrilogy. So we were both right. It is out through Highwater Press. David, thanks very much for joining me and talking about it, and congratulations on its release.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.